part 4 of this DIY tutorial. So in this video we'll be covering baking your clay and sanding your clay components. So if you've created all of your pieces on your piece of baking paper, all you'll need to do is slide that piece of baking paper onto a tray to go into the oven. Now with your oven, longer and slower is much better. If you bake your clay above 130 degrees, it is going to crack and burn. The instructions do say 130. I've always had much better success around the 110, 120 degree mark. Depending on how hot your oven is, I go 100 and about 15 for about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour. I would recommend at this point either you've taken a photo before you put it into the oven or take a photo after it comes out of the oven, just so that you know how your earrings go back together. Now, when you bake them, I usually just let it cool down in the oven, but it's fine to take it out of the oven and just wait until the tray and the pieces cool down before you work with them. So here they're out of the oven and your pieces should be somewhat flexible. If they're not, it just means that either they haven't been baked for long enough or they've been baked too hot. So I've got myself some wet dry sandpaper and a little bit of water here. You can use that sandpaper, as the name implies, wet or dry. Wet is just my personal preference for this. So I've got my circle piece that I'm going to sand first. When we're sanding off any ridges, and in our pattern pieces you will find that the colour has dragged down through your piece as well. So when I look from the side of my clay, I want to see a nice crisp edge between my colours. Now with a circle you want to roll it as you're going. If you start to sand it just back and forward, nice and flat, you're going to sand a flat edge on your circle, which is something that you want to avoid. So with your circle pieces, make sure you're rotating your wrist and sanding it in a curve as you go. So here again, what I'm doing is I'm sanding off any of those edges on the back, and you can see I've sanded off any colour that may have dragged down through there as well. Now all of your pieces will need a sand. Personally, this is my least favourite part of the whole earring making process, but it is probably one of the most important steps, because without it your earring pairs when they're finished just don't quite look as polished. So with the wet dry sandpaper, if you start to get a build up in your sandpaper, what you can do is just pop it back in the water, give it a little bit of a rub, and all of those polymer clay particles will have come off. So here I've got my arch piece and I'm making sure that I'm sanding off every single edge. So sanding the flat bottom off, and I had a little bit of a ridge on the back as well, just where I cut that with that plastic knife. It's left a little bit of a bubble. So again, round and round in circles just to try and flatten that off. So it's starting to flatten out there, that little bubble on the back. It'll get there. So to get into all of those cracks and crevices, remember we need to sand every single edge. What I do is I fold the sandpaper up. I don't use my nail and do a nice sharp crease, just keeping it nice and round so I can get right up nice and high into that little archy bit there. So it is a bit of a tight fit. We're just doing the best we can to smoothen off the edge. That's something that I'd probably do right at the end, just because if you have done a couple of those arches and you're folding your sandpaper, it's going to wreck the integrity of it a little bit. So here I've just got a flat colour, a straight edge. I can just on the sandpaper run that back and forward and just take the sharpness off. Again on the corners, just giving them a little touch up just so it's a little bit smoother. So I've got my triangle. As you can see, there's a bit of a ridge on the back there. I've just sanded the edge there, and then to sand the back, all I need to do is hold it and just rub it around in circles. If you're someone who's got fake nails, just be really careful, or even if you have long nails, with the way that you're holding this, just so you don't also file your nails down. So once you've sanded all your pieces, the next thing to do is to give them a bit of a bath. So on that black And on this cinnamon, you can see that I've got a lot of little white marks on them. Now that's nothing to worry about. Those white marks are just the sanded off clay particles sticking to your earrings. So what I've got is a little bit of water and a teeny tiny bit of hand soap. You might like to use a bit of dishwashing detergent, but as long as it's just a teeny tiny bit. I've got a face washer here. You might like to use a towel, a hand towel, paper towel. I've seen other makers use a bit of a carpet square before. And any bit that's a little bit stubborn after it's come out of the bath and needs a bit of elbow grease, I'm just rubbing it along that, and it's going to buff off any of those stubborn sanded particles that are showing up as white, and it's going to make sure that your piece is nice and crisp. It mainly happens on the darker colours. On the white you're not going to really notice because those particles are like a light colour anyway, they don't tend to show up. So in our next video we're going to cover actually putting the earrings together. It's the last part of the video series, so I hope you've enjoyed watching this one, and I will see you in part 5.